Once again from the campus of St. Bonaventure High School with Max again behind the camera and me again in front of the camera. Welcome to the next episode of the Our Lady of the Assumption Adult Dad Faith Formation weekly gospel podcasts, where we get to sit down with each other every week, 15, 20 minutes, unpack the Sunday gospel reading. So when we hear it proclaimed, as we always say, we'll have a better understanding of and a better appreciation for what the Word of God has for us. This is podcast episode 161, if you can believe it. It is the 14th Sunday of Ordinary Time. It is July 5th, the day after our nation's 250th anniversary. This is the year of Matthew. We will be in the Gospel of Matthew. Last couple of weeks, we've been working our way through chapter 10. This week we'll be in chapter 11. We'll be kind of almost all the way through it. It'll be chapter 11, verses 25 to 30. And as we've said any number of times in these podcasts, even though it's only a relatively short gospel reading, 5 verses, you can't exhaust God. There's a lot going on here. So we'll see if we can kind of bring what's going on to the surface. We'll front end it with a little background and context. And then hopefully when we hear it, either Saturday Vigil or Sunday Mass, it'll have a lot more meaning for us possibly this time around than it has in the past. So with all of that, Matthew 11, verses 25 to 30, only 5 verses. Let me read them to you. We'll start with a little context, and then we'll go ahead and unpack the reading proper. So here's what we will hear this Sunday. At that time, Jesus said in reply, I give praise to you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for although you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, you have revealed them to the childlike. Yes, Father, such has been your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wishes to reveal him. Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light. That is Matthew 11, verses 25 to 30, our gospel reading for this Sunday, the 14th Sunday of Ordinary Time. So let's front end it with a little context, and then we'll take a look at the passage itself. It starts out at that time. So the first question we've got to ask ourselves is, what time? Okay? And now let's go back to the dozen verses or so before them. Okay? So before Jesus says what he says in these 5 verses, okay, he has given some very stinging rebukes to a couple of towns, okay? Because, what he said is, when he went to Chorazin and Bethsaida, okay, he pronounced a woe on those towns because he told those towns, you know something? If Tyre and Sidon, who were pagan towns, if they would have seen the miracles I performed with you guys, they would have repented. Now that is a stinging rebuke. He's telling these 2 towns, Chorazin and Bethsaida, that if Tyre and Sidon, pagan towns, would have seen what you've seen, they would have repented. But you did see what I've done, and you haven't repented, so woe on you. And then he calls out Capernaum. Now, Capernaum was the home of Peter, and it was the kind of the home base for Jesus during his public ministry. And he says, Capernaum, okay, had Sodom seen what you guys saw, they would have repented, and they would have never been wiped out. But you guys did see it, and you haven't repented. So he's given 3 towns who have heard his teaching and seen his miracles, and therefore should have repented, but didn't. And he says, if these other pagan towns would have heard and seen what you heard and seen, even they would have repented. But you haven't. So essentially, what does that say about you? All right. So he's giving these towns that have seen and heard him a very stinging rebuke of condemnation for not repenting once they saw and they heard. Okay. Now we move into these verses, right? And then Jesus says to his Father, I give praise to you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for although you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, you have revealed them to the childlike. All right? Now, who are the wise and the learned? Okay? Primarily, he's talking about the Jewish religious leaders. Okay? They're wise, they're learned, they knew the scriptures, they knew the law of Moses, they were tasked with bringing the people to God, right? And despite their wisdom, despite their knowledge, despite the gifts that they've been given, right? Despite the position that they have been tasked with, okay? They rejected Jesus. And they will eventually, right, they will eventually kill him, all right? Now, who are the childlike? The ones that are humble, the ones that are open to what Jesus is saying and Jesus is doing, the ones that are open to the gospel that he's preaching, okay? So he's kind of comparing the wise and the arrogant with the humble and the lowly, just as he did with the towns, okay? He said, you towns that heard and seen me and should have repented didn't. Well, you wise and learned people that should have accepted me and received me and repented didn't, right? However, the humble and the lowly have. So, he's comparing on an individual basis what he just talked about on a town-wide basis, right? And he's kind of comparing and contrasting those, whether they're people or entire towns, that are arrogant and wise and all this in their own estimation, okay? And because of that are not open to what Jesus is saying and preaching. They're not open to the gospel. They're not open to the kingdom, okay? And he's comparing them with the ones that are open, the ones that are willing to receive, the ones that are childlike in their dependence, that are more open and that are willing and that are receiving the gospel, right? And interestingly enough, okay, this business of hiding things from the wise and the learned and revealing them to the childlike, this is in our passage today. But we'll see the same kind of thing 2 chapters later in Matthew 13. Because in Matthew 13, Jesus starts to talk to the people in parables. It was a shift. And the disciples ask him, hey, Jesus, why now all of a sudden are you talking to them not in straight teachings, but you're talking to them in parables? Okay? And what does Jesus say? Okay? He basically says the reason is because those that can see aren't, and those that can hear aren't. Because if they did, they would repent. And they don't want to repent, so they refuse to see and refuse to hear, right? So, right before this passage, in this passage, and 2 chapters from now, when he shifts to teaching parables, the common thread is, you've got 2 groups of people, okay? Those that are wise and knowledgeable and all that in their own estimation and are arrogant and prideful, and because of that don't feel they need the gospel, don't feel they need God, versus those that are more humble and open and childlike, that do see their need for the gospel, that do see their need for God, and therefore are open to Jesus and his preaching and his miracles. Okay? He's contrasting those two groups. Now, the second half of this verse is a saying that we're familiar with, where he says, "Come to me, all those who labor and are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." And then he says, "Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, he says a couple of things in here, okay, that we have to kind of flesh out. He says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened." All right. Now, what kind of burdens is he talking about? Well, Jesus, one of the things he will accuse, and rightly so, the religious leaders of doing, is laying, and here's the key here, he even uses the same terminology, of laying heavy burdens upon the people, okay? Now, what are these heavy burdens these Jewish religious leaders are putting on the people? Again, in order to make sure, and again, they started out with good intent, but they kind of went awry, in order to make sure that the people were not violating the Mosaic law, right? Not violating the Ten Commandments, not violating the covenant, right? In order to make sure that the people didn't come close to coming close to violating the Mosaic law, they built a fence around the Mosaic law. They constructed all kinds of rules that they thought would prevent people from even coming close to violating the law. And the classic example that's always used was the commandment, or it says, "Keep holy the Sabbath, do no work." Okay? Well, they said, okay, we want to make sure that we don't violate that we don't do work on the Sabbath, that in not doing work, we keep the Sabbath holy. That's fine. But then they said to themselves, okay, we got to define what work is. And then they came up with all different examples of what work is. And they started going down rabbit holes, as we say. Let me give you two examples. One example of what they considered, not God, what they considered work, was carrying a load or a burden a certain distance. So if you carried a load or a burden for a certain distance, that was work. And that would violate the Sabbath. And then they said, well, okay, gosh, now we've got to define what kind of load and what kind of burden. And now we've got to establish, for what amount of distance. So you see, they kind of just went down rabbit holes trying to come up with man-made rules to make sure that the people didn't violate the Sabbath. You think I'm making this up, but I'm not. Another one was a woman could not look in the mirror on the Sabbath day. That was work. And if you're thinking, how the heck can they say that's work? Okay. Well, they say, because the problem here is if a woman looks in the mirror and she sees a gray hair, she'll want to pluck it out. And the plucking out of the gray hair constitutes work, and of course, then that would violate the Sabbath. So therefore, to prevent a woman from doing work and plucking out a gray hair, she can't even look in the mirror on the Sabbath. That's how thin they continued to slice these things. And you could see where, if you were trying to be a devout Jewish person, all right, and you were trying to keep the Sabbath holy and not do work, boy, look at the hoops you would have to jump through. You would have to say, okay, I can't do any work, all right? That means I can't carry these burdens for this distance. I can't look in the mirror for the sake of maybe, plucking out a gray hair. I can't ride my animal because then I'd have to prepare the saddle, and preparing the saddle would be work. You could see where trying to keep that one commandment would be so burdensome that it got to the point where you were so worried about violating one of their man-made rules that you lost the whole aspect of what the Sabbath was meant to be in the first place. And that was driving the devout Jewish person crazy, trying to make sure he checked off all these boxes and he didn't do anything that would constitute what they considered work would be. Can you imagine trying to live up to that? All right. So when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are labor and are heavy burdened," he's talking to the Jewish people who are laboring and heavy burdened under making sure they don't violate any of these literally hundreds of man-made laws that the Pharisees came up with, okay? Because again, he's saying, my burden is easy and my burden is light. Because again, it's not a question of box checking, right? It's not a question of making sure you don't violate any of their man-made laws. It comes from the heart, right? If you love God, the reason Jesus can say his burden is light and his yoke is easy, because if you have the proper condition of heart, if you love God, then out of love for him, you're going to want to serve him. You're going to want to please him. You're going to want to obey his commandments. Not because you have to, not out of obligation, but out of love. It'll be kind of natural for you. It'll be part of your nature. It'll be organic, right? So rather than obeying all of these minute man-made laws that the Pharisees came up with, okay, the key is if you turn your heart to God and you really love him, you will keep these commandments, including the Sabbath, right? You will keep these commandments out of love and wanting to please and honor and serve God. Not because you're worried sick that you might violate one of these man-made rules and the Pharisees will come down on you, okay? So that's who he's talking to when he says, "Come to me, you are the Jewish people who are labored and heavy burdened." That's how they were being burdened by the man-made rules and regulations that the Pharisees put on them. He says, "Come to me, love me, and you won't violate any of these. You'll obey what needs to be obeyed out of love. And it won't be burdensome to you. You won't be heavy burdened and you won't labor because you'll be doing it out of love. You'll be doing it organically. You'll be doing it because you want to, not because you have to." And then the other thing we should kind of bring out, the terminology that Jesus uses, he says, "Take my yoke upon me, for my yoke is easy." And when we're talking about a yoke, okay, back then, when you were a farmer, if you owned land and you had animals, you had beasts of burden, right? And you used the animals to till the soil, getting it ready for planting, right? You'd have your two animals, right? And you'd yoke them together. You put a collar on both of them, right? So that when they went through the field, and you put a plow behind them, so as they went through the field and drug the plow behind them, the yoke would keep them side by side. One wouldn't get in front of the other. And when the animals were side by side, kind of stepping in unison, okay, that made moving the plow easier, and it made plowing the field easier and more effective. So Jesus is saying, okay, just like one animal being yoked to another made the task easier, if you're yoked to me, if you take my yoke upon you, rather than the Pharisees' yoke of all these man-made rules, if you take my yoke upon you, okay, and we go through this together, all right, that's how we want to do it. So that's kind of what he's getting at. Max, love him to death. And he always puts the counter in front of me when I go over the 15-minute mark. So I'm staring at 20 minutes right now. That's what Jesus is getting to. So that's kind of the background and the context for the first half of this reading, where he's talking about, not revealing things to some and revealing them to others. And then the second half of the verses, where he's talking about his yoke being light versus the Pharisees' yoke, which is heavy and heavy burdened. In fact, and you might say, well, is Jesus' yoke really that light? Okay, look at what the evangelist John, the one who wrote the Gospel of John, right? He wrote a couple of letters, a couple of epistles. Listen to what he says in his first letter, 1 John chapter 5, verse 3. Okay, this is John, one of the apostles. He says, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." So when Jesus says, "My yoke is not burdensome," John picks up on that. He affirms and confirms it, because he says, in essence, what we're saying here today, that if you love God, you will obey his commandments out of love, not because you have to, not because you're forced to, not for fear of what's going to happen. You'll keep his commandments because you love him. And if that's your motivation for keeping his commandments, then his commandments are not burdensome, because you're doing it because you want to out of love for him. So with that, now I'm at the 21.5-minute mark. That's the reading for this 14th Sunday of Ordinary Time. Hopefully I've made myself understandable. So when you hear these verses proclaimed, again, you'll have a little background and context from which to set them against, so that the meaning might come to you, a little bit more profoundly maybe than it has in the past. So with that, I now will wrap up this podcast. For Max behind the camera, again, I'm Charles Merritt, and as always, take care and God bless.